It was the kind of October day Minnesotans know well. That strange in between time when the air carries a bite, but the sun is still warm enough to fool you into leaving your jacket unzipped. The trees were at their peak, leaves the color of fire, deep crimsons, golden yellows, rust orange, clinging stubbornly to their branches. The smell of fallen leaves mixed with the faint scent of wood smoke from chimneys. It looked like the kind of day meant for pumpkin patches, hay rides, and comfort food. A safe, ordinary day. In Savage, Minnesota, a quiet suburb around 20 minutes south of Minneapolis, Catherine Olson was heading out the door. She slung her well-worn shoulder bag across her body, jingled her keys in her hand, and locked the door behind her. It wasn't unusual. Babysitting was something she had done dozens of times before. To her, this was routine. A little way to make money, help out a family, maybe squeeze in dinner with friends after. What Catherine couldn't have known is that the job she was heading toward wasn't real. The ad she'd answered wasn't written by a mom looking for childcare. It wasn't even written by a woman at all. It was bait, a carefully laid trap posted by a 19-year-old boy living in his parents' basement. A boy who wasn't curious about babysitting or in need of help. He wanted to know what it felt like to kill. And by the time the day ended, Catherine Olson's life would be stolen in one of the most chilling crimes Minnesota has ever seen. Catherine was 24 years old. Born and raised in Eden Prairie, she'd grown up in a tight-knit family with her parents, Rolf and Nancy, and her younger sister, Sarah. People described her as a light bringer. She laughed easily, loved deeply, and carried a spark into every room. She wasn't just the kind of person who had friends. She was the kind of person who made you feel like you belonged. She was artistic, drawn to theater and music, and had a wanderer's heart. After graduating from Eden Prairie High School, she went on to St. Olaf College, earning a degree in Spanish and theater. She'd even spent time abroad in Spain, falling in love with the language, the food, the culture. She came back fluent and full of stories, always eager to share them. But she wasn't just adventurous, she was grounded. She loved kids and found joy in caring for them. Babysitting wasn't something she just did for extra cash. It was something she genuinely enjoyed. Friends recalled how she would bring along little craft kits, coloring books, and games, never content to just plop kids in front of a TV. She made every child feel special, like the most important person in the room. On the morning of October 25th, 2007, Catherine left her townhouse in St. Louis Park and set out for Savage. She answered an ad on Craigslist, signed by Amy, supposedly a young mother looking for a babysitter. Craigslist in 2007 wasn't viewed the way it is now. It was mainstream, casual, widely trusted. You found couches, roommates, jobs, even friendships there. The dangers weren't front page news. To Catherine, it seemed like an ordinary gig. Amy didn't exist. The ad had been written by Michael John Anderson, a 19-year-old who lived in his parents' suburban home. To his neighbors, he was forgettable, the quiet, awkward kid down the street. Pale, heavy-set, often withdrawn, he worked part-time at a local bowling alley. Nothing about him screamed danger. If anything, he was invisible. But behind the glow of his computer screen, Anderson was different. He spent long hours online in chat rooms and forums, hiding behind usernames, while he spelled out his violent fantasies. He typed about killing, about what it might feel like to end a life. Investigators later uncovered one post that read like a blueprint. Lure a babysitter with a fake ad, invite her in, and kill her. It was so specific, that when detectives eventually found it, it felt like he had confessed before he ever pulled the trigger. Anderson's world was small: a basement bedroom, a screen, and a fantasy that grew darker by day. He wasn't content just imagining anymore. He wanted to make it real. And Catherine, tragically, was the one who walked into his plan. The address Catherine was given led her to Todd Drive in Savage, a neighborhood that looked like the picture of safety. Quiet cul-de-sacs curled around tidy houses with trimmed lawns and bikes leaning against garages. On any other day, Catherine might have thought it was charming, even boring. There was nothing about it to suggest danger. She pulled into the driveway of the Anderson home in her red Pontiac Grand Am, gathered her bag, and walked up the steps, expecting to meet a young mom named Amy. Instead, she was greeted by Michael. What happened next will never be fully known. No one else was there to witness the exchange, but prosecutors later pieced together a likely sequence of events. At some point, Anderson lured her into the basement, a dim, unfinished space with concrete floors, exposed beams, and mismatched furniture. It was the last place she would ever stand alive. There, Anderson pulled out a 357 Magnum revolver. The shot that killed Catherine entered her back, evidence suggesting she had tried to run. Perhaps she sensed something was wrong too late. Perhaps she turned towards the stairs, desperate to escape. The bullet tore through her body, dropping her instantly. With chilling calm, Anderson then dragged her body upstairs and out the driveway. He forced her into the trunk of her own car, a smear of blood left behind as a silent marker of violence. Then he climbed into the driver's seat and drove. He didn't go far. He took Catherine's car to Burnsville Nature Preserve, a nearby wooded area. It was the kind of place people went to jog, walk their dogs, or take their kids to explore the trails. He left the car parked haphazardly, half hidden near a path, and walked away. The same afternoon, joggers making their way through the preserve noticed the red Pontiac. Something about it felt off. It wasn't just that it was parked oddly, it seemed abandoned, out of place in the peaceful surroundings. They called it in. When police arrived and popped the trunk, they were met with a sight they would never forget. Inside was Catherine Olson, lifeless, folded unnaturally into the small space, her vibrant future stolen in an instant. By nightfall, the news had spread. Friends who had expected to hear from Catherine were calling her phone, getting no answer. Her parents were holding out hope it was all some mistake. But by the time local stations broke the story, Minnesota knew. A young woman had been murdered after answering a Craigslist babysitting ad. The shockwaves rippled instantly. How could this happen in Savage, in a quiet neighborhood on a bright October afternoon? And who was behind it? When police opened up Catherine's trunk and found her body, it wasn't just a shocking discovery. It was the beginning of a meticulous hunt for answers. Detectives knew they were looking for a staged drop-off, but now they needed to retrace her last hours and figure out who had set the trap. The first break came almost immediately. Detectives pulled her phone logs. The last number she dialed was for Amy, the babysitting mom she thought she was meeting. The number wasn't registered to any woman, though. It led straight back to the Anderson household. Investigators also saw Catherine had exchanged multiple calls with Amy that morning, setting up the job. Already, the story started to unravel. The car itself was a crime scene. Forensic teams dusted it for prints, photographed the blood smear on the bumper, and collected hair and fiber samples. Inside the trunk, they found a pool of Catherine's blood, proof she had been moved after she was shot. What stood out was how little effort had been made to hide things. The car wasn't stripped of evidence. Anderson hadn't wiped it down. To police, It seemed almost careless, as if he didn't think anyone could connect him. Detectives canvassed the neighborhoods of Savage and Burnsville, pulling every bit of footage they could find: gas stations, convenience stores, even traffic cams. One clip showed Catherine's red Pontiac entering Burnsville Nature Preserve the same afternoon she disappeared. No one got out of the car, it was simply left there. With the phone number pointing straight to Anderson, police secured a search warrant for his family's home on Todd Drive. In the basement, investigators found shell casings that matched the bullet removed from Catherine's body. The .357 Magnum revolver itself was tucked inside his bedroom closet, wrapped in a towel. A single drop of blood, later confirmed as Catherine's, was discovered near the laundry area of the basement. The basement itself told its own story: dim, unfinished, concrete floor, boxes stacked in corners, a place where screams might never reach the neighbors. Prosecutors would later argue that this wasn't random, it was chosen. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from Anderson's computer. Forensic specialists cloned the hard drive and began combing through deleted files, chat logs, and browser history. What they uncovered erased any doubt. Deleted chat room conversations where Anderson described violent fantasies, forum posts about luring a babysitter to see what it would feel like to kill, search terms like how to make a fake Craigslist ad, and information about revolvers. When detectives brought Anderson in for questioning, they didn't lay all their cards on the table. They began casually. What was he doing on October 25th? Did he ever post babysitting ads? Did he know anyone named Catherine? At first, he flatly denied everything, but as soon as investigators confronted him with the phone records tied to his phone numbers, cracks started to show. Anderson never confessed outright. Instead, he slouched in the chair, pale and blank, almost as if the entire conversation bored him. One detective later said he was cold, like he was talking about someone else's life, not the young woman he'd murdered. On October 27th, just 2 days after Catherine was last seen alive, police arrested Michael John Anderson for first-degree murder. Neighbors spilled into the streets as news crews arrived. To them, he had always been the quiet kid down the block, someone you barely noticed. Now, he was being led away in handcuffs as the first person in the U.S. charged with a Craigslist-related murder. The trial of Michael John Anderson began in March of 2009, more than a year after Catherine's murder. By then, her story was national news, the first known murder linked directly to a Craigslist ad. Reporters from across the country descended on Shakopee, filling the Scott County Courthouse. Before testimony even began, the process of selecting a jury revealed how much weight this case carried. Potential jurors were asked if they had seen news reports about the Craigslist babysitter murder. Many admitted they had. Some were dismissed because they couldn't promise to set aside what they'd read. Others broke down, saying the idea of hearing about the killing of a young woman so close to their own kids was too much to handle. After days of questioning, a panel of 12 jurors and 2 alternates was chosen. They were warned this case would involve graphic evidence and testimony, and they would be asked to judge whether a 19-year-old had committed premeditated murder. Scott County prosecutors painted Anderson as someone who had fantasized for years about killing and finally put his plan into motion. Their evidence was stacked, almost overwhelming. But beyond hard evidence, prosecutors worked to show intent. This wasn't an accident, not a sudden fit of rage, but a carefully laid trap. They read aloud Anderson's disturbing online posts, where he mused about what it might feel like to kill. The jurors sat in silence as the words were displayed, some visibly shifting in their seats. Anderson's team tried to pry open any reasonable doubt they could find. Their central argument was that someone else might have used Anderson's computer and his phone, that maybe he was being framed, or at the very least, wasn't the one behind the keyboard. They suggested Anderson's friends sometimes logged into his accounts. They pointed out the lack of eyewitnesses to the shooting itself, and they tried, at moments, to portray him as an awkward, socially isolated teenager who didn't fully grasp the seriousness of his online words. But every time the defense raised doubt, prosecutors countered with evidence. The IP address from Anderson's own bedroom, a revolver hidden in his closet, the phone records placing him in direct contact with Catherine. The Olsen family sat through every day of testimony. Catherine's parents, Rolf and Nancy, often wore purple, her favorite color. Friends from St. Olaf College filled the benches, some clutching photos of her, others pinning buttons with her smiling face. Reporters described the atmosphere as tense, almost suffocating. At times, testimony was so clinical, blood patterns, ballistic matches, autopsy reports, that it stripped the humanity from what happened. But then Catherine's parents would take the stand, or a friend would speak about her joy for life. And the courtroom would shift, the weight of loss suddenly undeniable. Observers noted that Anderson showed little emotion throughout the trial. He rarely looked at the ocean. He rarely looked at the Olsen family. During graphic testimony, he sometimes stared at the table, adjusting his glasses, expression flat. Prosecutors later called this chilling, as if the crime and the trial belonged to someone else. By the time closing arguments came, the prosecution framed Anderson's crime as not just murder, but a calculated act of cruelty. This was not an accident. This was not impulsive. This was a young man who wanted to kill, who made a plan, and who carried it out with precision. The defense urged jurors to consider Anderson's age, to weigh the possibility that this was the work of a confused teenager with fantasies, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt of premeditated murder. Deliberations lasted less than a day. When the jury returned, the courtroom went silent. Anderson was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. The Olsen family held hands as the sentence was read. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Rolf and Nancy Olsen gave a brief statement, their voices breaking but steady. Our daughter was a beautiful, vibrant young woman who touched so many lives. The world is darker without her in it. Today's verdict does not bring her back, but it brings justice. Within days, national outlets like CNN, NBC, and the New York Times picked up Catherine's story. The phrase Craigslist killer began appearing in headlines, a label that would later be attached to other cases but began here in Minnesota. It was chilling for readers across the country. Craigslist had exploded in popularity in the early 2000s as a one-stop shop for jobs, apartments, used furniture, and odd jobs. Millions trusted it daily. Catherine's death exposed the dark side of anonymity. Anyone, anywhere, could post an ad with little oversight. Parents began warning their children not to trust online ads. College campuses held emergency safety seminars. Suddenly, every Craigslist meeting, whether for a used couch or a babysitting gig, came with suspicion. Craigslist itself came under heavy fire. Lawmakers demanded reforms. Advocacy groups called for greater accountability. Catherine's murder wasn't the first crime connected to the site, but it was the first murder to dominate national news. In response, Craigslist began encouraging users to meet in public places and pushed new safety guidelines. Police departments across the country started offering safe exchange zones in station parking lots, lit and monitored by cameras, where buyers and sellers could meet without fear. And though Craigslist resisted sweeping regulation at first, Catherine's story was a tipping point. By the time later cases emerged, Boston Craigslist killer Philip Markoff in 2009, the platform was forced to overhaul categories, police its ads more directly, and even eliminate some sections entirely, such as personals. For Rolf and Nancy Olson, grief became a mission. They spoke at conferences and schools about online safety. They warned parents, teens, and college students alike. Trust isn't automatic, even in digital spaces that feel familiar. Nancy once said in an interview, Catherine trusted the world because she was good. She didn't live her life in fear, but because of that, others have to learn from her story. The Olsons worked with advocacy groups to push for safer online practices, making sure Catherine's name wasn't just linked to tragedy, but to prevention and change. Locally, Catherine's murder changed behavior. Parents began insisting their teens call or text when they arrived at babysitting jobs. Friends told each other where they were going before answering ads. College campuses began offering training on how to spot scams and risky situations online. In Minnesota, police used Catherine's case in presentations for years afterward, reminding young people that evil doesn't always look like a shadowy figure in a dark alley. Sometimes it looks like a friendly ad in a safe neighborhood. Catherine's story became a part of a larger cultural reckoning with how the internet had outpaced safety. In the late 2000s, social media and online marketplaces were exploding, but laws and protections hadn't caught up. Her case helped ignite the conversation. By the 2010s, platforms across the web, from Craigslist to Facebook Marketplace, had adopted safety warnings, disclaimers, and stricter posting rules. Local police across the country set up exchange sites, and every day users become more cautious, less trusting of anonymous listings. For Catherine's family, that legacy was bittersweet. The safety changes couldn't bring her back, but they could prevent another daughter, another friend, another young woman from being lured into a trap. 17 years later, Catherine's story still lingers. In Eden Prairie, friends remember her laugh, her love of Spanish theater, her joy with children. On college campuses, her name is mentioned in online safety discussions. She was just 24, with her whole life ahead. She wasn't careless, she wasn't reckless, she was kind hearted, and that kindness led her into a trap she could never have imagined. Her legacy is both a warning and a reminder that the internet is powerful, but so are the unseen dangers it carries, and that even in the most ordinary moments, a babysitting job, a drive across town, lives can forever be changed. Up in northern Minnesota, there's a saying: the mines took as much as they gave. They gave paychecks, roofs over heads, food on the table, but they also took fathers, sons, and brothers, swallowing them into the earth, sometimes never to be seen again. And in Ely, there's one legend that still sends chills down spines. A story about a miner who never made it back to the surface, but whose presence, frozen and unyielding, might still linger in the dark. They call him the Frozen Miner. To understand this legend, you have to understand Ely itself. Nestled against the Boundary Waters, Ely was carved out of wilderness and built on iron. In the late 1800s, word spread that the Mesabi and Vermilion Ranges held some of the richest iron ore in the world, and men came flooding in from across the ocean. Finland, Slovenia, Italy, Croatia, they arrived with little more than their tools, their traditions, and the hope that the mines would give them a better life. The work was punishing, the winters were long, and Ely sat in one of the coldest corners of Minnesota. But inside the mines, the cold felt alive, an enemy that never let up. One Finnish miner's journal described descending into the shaft as walking into the throat of winter. Water dripped constantly from the rock, running down the walls and freezing into jagged curtains of ice. The air was damp and bitter, heavy with dust that clawed at its lungs. By midday, boots were stiff as boards, caked in frozen mud. Explosives cracked through the tunnels so often that the men stopped flinching, though each blast rattled their bones and shook loose more shards of ice from the ceiling. And the darkness, miners would later say, it was the worst part. Lantern light stretched maybe 10 feet before dissolving into pitch black. You could be standing shoulder to shoulder with another man, and beyond that, it felt like the earth itself was swallowing you whole. Claustrophobic, silent, endless. This was Ely's foundation, a town built not on comfort, but on endurance. And when stories began to circulate about men who went down into those shafts and never came back, men whose bodies froze deep in the rock, it wasn't hard to believe. In a place like this, the line between survival and legend was paper thin. The story goes that sometime in the early 1900s, deep in the Pioneer Mine, the shift began like any other. Men worked shoulder to shoulder, swinging picks, setting charges, coughing through the dust. It was the kind of day where you could feel the rock pressing in from every side, a living weight overhead. Then the ground shuddered. A low groan rippled through the shaft, a sound every miner dreaded. Timber supports snapped like gunshots, and before anyone could react, the ceiling gave way. His name depends on who tells the story. Some say he was a Finn named Giuseppe. Others swear he was an Italian named Marco. Whoever he was, when the rock came down, he had no chance. The collapse pitched him into a hidden pocket of frigid water beneath the shaft. He struggled, but the rock pinned his leg. His crew clawed at the rubble with their bare hands, voices hoarse from shouting his name. But the tunnel was unstable. Every strike risked another cave-in. Hours blended into the night. Lanterns burned low. The men finally had to retreat. They promised they would come back, with better tools, with more help. But when rescuers returned the next day, the mine was silent. They found him still there, half submerged, upright, frozen solid. The water around him had turned to ice, entombing his body like glass. His face slack, but eerily intact, as if caught in the moment before a final breath. Some swore his eyelids were half open, pupils clouded, yet staring, watching them. The men recoiled. Superstition ran deep underground, and this was an omen. To touch him was to invite the same fate. None would bring him up. Instead, they sealed the tunnel with timber, hammering boards across the passage, the sound echoing the black shaft like a funeral drum. And there he remained, encased in ice, entombed in the rock, waiting. Not long after the collapse, strange stories began to spread through Ely's mining camps. At first, they were told in whispers, after a shift in the dim light of a tavern or a boarding house bunk room. But soon, every crew had heard them. One miner claimed he'd been working alone when his lantern flickered, and there, at the far end of the tunnel, stood a man. His skin was pale as frost, his clothes dripping as though he'd just crawled up out of the water. The lantern light reflected off him strangely, as if it were shining on glass. But when the miner called out, the figure didn't answer. He simply turned and melted into the shadows. Another swore he heard knocking, 3 sharp taps echoing through the rock. He thought it was a coworker signaling him from another shaft, but when he followed the sound, his stomach dropped. It was coming from the sealed passage, the one where the frozen miner lay. In 1912, a Slovenian miner named Anton staggered into a tavern after his shift, pale and shaking. He told anyone who would listen that while swinging his pick, he felt hands clamp down on his shoulders, not warm and sweaty like a living man's, but icy, heavy. He dropped his pick where he stood and never went back down. It was like the dead had come to claim me, he told the tavern keeper, and he meant it. He left Ely for good. Over time, stories multiplied, tools going missing, only to reappear near the sealed shaft, lantern flames guttering out whenever men worked too close to it. Some claimed they could hear faint splashes like footsteps moving in water long after the tunnels had dried. The story might have stayed just that, a ghost tale passed around after a few too many drinks, if not for what happened after. Every time there was a serious accident in Ely's mines, someone swore they had seen the frozen miner beforehand. The sightings came like warnings, whispered only after it was too late. In 1915, when a charge-off went early and killed 3 men, survivors whispered among themselves that days earlier a pale figure had been spotted lingering near the ladderways. No one admitted it at the time. They only spoke of it after the funerals when the rumor had already spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before the frozen miner became more than a ghost story. Old-timers warned the greenhorns straight to their faces, "If you see him, get out. Someone's going to die." And the young miners listened, because by then, the frozen miner wasn't just haunting Ely's tunnels. He was shaping the way men worked underground and the way they feared the dark. Above the ground, families lived close enough to hear the blasts of dynamite every day. The sound rolled through the streets like thunder. Wives would pause mid-chore. Kids in the schoolyard would stop playing, waiting to see if the noise was routine or if something had gone wrong. Everyone knew the signs. If the church bells rang at the wrong hour, or the mine whistle wailed long and low, it meant only one thing: men weren't coming home. Mothers would clutch their children and rush into the streets, scanning the faces of miners stumbling out of the shaft, covered in dust, limping, shaken, but alive, and behind them, the gap left by those who wouldn't return. Mothers told their children not to linger near the mine entrances at night. That's where he waits. For wives, the story was harder. A man trapped, left behind, frozen in place. It was their greatest fear given shape. And when real accidents struck, when a blast went wrong or a tunnel gave way, the legend always resurfaced. Widows muttered that the frozen miner had warned them. Survivors swore they had seen him. To Ely's families, he became more than a ghost. He was a reminder that in this town, the mines never gave back everything they took. When Ely's mines finally closed, the shafts didn't stop whispering. The tunnels, once alive with the clang of picks and the crack of dynamite, grew silent. But silence only made the stories louder. Teenagers dared each other to sneak past the no trespassing signs and into the abandoned passages. They came back wide-eyed, swearing the air dropped 20 degrees without warning, or that their lanterns sputtered for no reason. A few claimed they saw more: the shape of a man standing perfectly in the dark, his skin pale as ice, his eyes cloudy, half open, just as the old stories described. Hunters, too, told their own tales. Out on the edge of town in the dead of winter, some said they spotted a lone figure moving stiffly along the tree line. He didn't leave tracks in the snow. He didn't turn his head when called to, just kept walking, slow and unnatural, as though he was still frozen. Even today, if you visit the old pioneer mine, now a museum, you'll hear whispers about him. Guides will lower their voices and mention the legend. Sometimes it's only in passing, almost as a joke. But if you catch them alone, away from the tour group, they'll admit it. Strange things still happen down there. Unexplained footsteps echo in empty drifts. Cold winds move through sealed tunnels. The legend has lasted for more than a century, passed from miner to miner, then from families to their children, until it became stitched to Ely itself. Like the seams of iron that built the town, it runs deep, part fact, part folklore, equal parts grief and superstition. Maybe the frozen miner was just one man, crushed and entombed in a pocket of ice, left behind in the panic of a collapse. Maybe he was never real at all, only a story born in the fear-filled dark of the shafts. Or maybe he's become something larger, a guardian spirit of Ely's mines, not alive, not dead, but forever warning those who dare to go underground that the earth takes what it wants, and it doesn't always give back. And if you ever find yourself in Ely on a cold night, with the wind cutting through the pines and the abandoned iron shafts groaning deep underground, listen closely. Locals say the tunnels still carry sounds, a shuffle of boots, the clang of steel on stone, and if you're unlucky, you might hear it too, the faint, steady tap of his pickaxe still echoing in the frozen dark. On the shore of Lake Superior in Duluth, Minnesota, stands a mansion that looks like it was plucked from another century. 39 rooms, grand staircases, marble fireplaces, a home built to be admired, protected, and passed down through generations. But for Minnesotans, when you hear the name Glensheen, you don't think of beauty. You think of blood on a staircase. You think of betrayal. You think of a summer morning in 1977 that turned one of the state's most famous homes into a crime scene. This is the story of the Congdon Mansion murders, better known as the Glensheen murders. Glensheen wasn't just another house, it was a statement. In the early 1900s, Chester Congdon, a mining tycoon who made his fortune in Minnesota's booming iron industry, decided he needed something that would leave a mark. He wanted a legacy carved into stone. So he built a sprawling 39-room mansion on the rocky shoreline of Lake Superior, a place that would make sure the Congdon name sat firmly among Minnesota's wealthy elite long after he was gone. Chester had 8 children. By 1977, only one was left. His youngest daughter, Elizabeth, now frail and nearly 83 years old. She had grown up inside Glensheen, the mansion her father built as both a family home and a monument to his wealth. Being the baby of the family and Chester's favorite meant she carried a special place in his heart. He was a mining tycoon, a lawyer, even a politician, but when it came to Elizabeth, he softened. Her youth was shaped by privilege, but she wasn't idle. She was well educated, lively, and independent. While her older siblings went on to marriages and lives elsewhere, Elizabeth stayed in Duluth and tied to Glensheen. When Chester died in 1916, his empire was divided, but Elizabeth's inheritance was substantial. Over the years, as siblings passed away, she inherited even more. By the time she reached her later years, she was one of the wealthiest women in Minnesota. But Elizabeth didn't use her fortune to live lavishly. Instead, she poured it into causes she cared about: hospitals, churches, schools, charities. Her generosity stretched across the state. To Duluth, she wasn't just the last Congdon living in Glensheen. She was the keeper of her father's legacy. And yet, that very legacy, the fortune Chester left behind to protect his family, would one day put Elizabeth in unimaginable danger. Elizabeth never married. Maybe it was a choice, maybe circumstance. But unlike her siblings, she never had children of her own. Instead, she adopted 2 little girls and raised them as her own. On paper, it was the perfect solution. Her father's legacy would live on through them. Elizabeth's 2 daughters could not have been more different. Jennifer, the eldest, lived a quiet life. She stayed out of trouble, avoided the spotlight, and rarely gave her mother reasons to worry. She wasn't chasing after wealth or recognition. She seemed content with ordinary stability. In a family tied to one of the grandest mansions in Minnesota, Jennifer chose something simpler. Because of that, history doesn't say much about her. She didn't leave behind headlines or scandals. She simply lived. Marjorie was the opposite. Where Jennifer was steady, Marjorie was restless. She had a presence that filled a room, a smile that made you think she was trustworthy, even charming. But the closer you got, the more you realized that charm often hid recklessness. Marjorie wanted a big life, the kind of life that fit the Congdon name. She wanted houses, cars, fine clothes, and attention. But the money wasn't there to sustain it. Again and again, she tried to live above her means, and again, it all came crashing down. By the 1970s, Marjorie's trail was littered with bad checks, unpaid debts, and foreclosures. Banks repossessed her homes. Creditors chased her down. Yet somehow, she always managed to move on to the next scheme, the next promise, the next fresh start. People who crossed paths with her often walked away burned, their trust misplaced. Marjorie's life was already turbulent on its own. Failed ventures, financial wreckage, relationships that seemed to collapse as soon as they started. But in the mid 1970s, she found someone who didn't calm the storm. He joined it. Her second husband, Roger Caldwell. Roger Caldwell wasn't born into money. He didn't have a famous family name or a mansion on the lake. What he did have was ambition, the kind that can push someone forward or eat them alive. On the surface, Roger was the kind of man people might trust at first. He was decent looking, carried himself with confidence, and could talk his way through a room. But underneath, he had a restless streak. He wasn't patient, he wasn't steady. He wanted the rewards without the grind it usually takes to earn them. Roger bounced from job to job, chasing opportunities that never seemed to last. He had a temper too, the kind that could flare quickly, especially when things didn't go his way. And more often than not, things didn't. By the time he crossed paths with Marjorie, his life was already full of frustrations, half-baked plans, and a desire to be someone bigger than he was. Marjorie recognized something in Roger. Maybe it was his hunger, maybe it was the way he didn't question her chaos but seemed to thrive in it, where most people eventually grew weary of her drama. Roger leaned in. He didn't just accept the storm, he became part of it. Their marriage wasn't about balance, it was about combustion. They matched each other's desperation, fed each other's recklessness, and together, they spiraled even faster than they ever had alone. And through it all, one thought kept creeping closer. Elizabeth, the frail woman in the wheelchair, the inheritance tied up in trusts, the fortune sitting just out of reach. For Marjorie and Roger, Elizabeth wasn't just family, she was the prize. The night of June 26, 1977, began like any other inside Glensheen. Elizabeth's nurses followed their usual routine: medications, a bit of light conversation, tucking her in upstairs. The house was massive, but at the end of the night, it felt small and hushed. The lake outside groaned with waves against the rocky shore, the kind of sound that lulled the mansion to sleep. One of Elizabeth's night nurses, Velma Pietla, settled into her shift. Velma was in her 50s, kind, dependable, the type of woman families trusted with their most vulnerable loved ones. For her, nights at Glensheen were quiet. The air was heavy with the smell of old wood and polish, the stillness broken only by the creak of the mansion settling into itself. Sometime after midnight, the silence broke. The intruder had slipped in through a back door. They weren't here to steal heirlooms or to admire the mansion's grandeur. They were here for something, someone specific. Velma was the first they encountered. She was attacked quickly, brutally, bludgeoned with a brass candlestick. The blow ended her life before she could reach the telephone, before she could even cry out loud enough to wake the rest of the house. Her body was left on the floor near the stairwell, a warning of what was to come. Upstairs, Elizabeth remained in bed, unaware. Frail in body, but still sharp of mind, she had trusted her nurses to keep her safe. The intruder moved silently through the halls, the old mansion swallowing their footsteps. When they reached Elizabeth's room, she had no way to fight back, no chance to run. She was smothered with her own satin pillow. It was quiet, efficient, and cruel. By the time dawn broke over Lake Superior, Elizabeth Congdon, the last surviving child of Chester Congdon, the keeper of his legacy, was dead. So was her nurse. Two women killed inside one of Minnesota's grandest homes. Glensheen was no longer a monument to wealth and legacy. It was a crime scene. Morning came to Glensheen like it always did. The sun climbing over Lake Superior, light spilling across the water, the waves slapping against the rocks below the mansion's cliffside. For the staff, it should have been another routine day of tending to Elizabeth, preparing meals, and keeping the estate in order. But the first signs that something was wrong appeared almost immediately. Day nurse Mildred Garview arrived. She stepped into the grand foyer like she always did, the cool air of the lake drifting through the house. But that morning, something felt different. As she climbed the mansion's sweeping staircase, she saw Velma slumped against the window seat. For a split second, Mildred might have thought her friend had fainted. But then she saw the blood. Velma's head had been struck again and again with a brass candlestick, her wrist half bound with a nylon stocking that hadn't held. Panic rising, Mildred rushed upstairs to Elizabeth's room. The heiress lay still in her bed, her face covered by a satin pillow. There were no signs of a struggle. She had been smothered in her sleep. The mansion, with its carved wood, stained glass, and elegant silence, had become a tomb. Shock ripped through the staff. Calls were made to the police, and soon the mansion was swarming with investigators. Glensheen, once a quiet Duluth landmark, was now the site of one of Minnesota's most infamous crime scenes. News of Elizabeth's death spread quickly. She wasn't just a wealthy old woman in a mansion. She was a Congdon, the last one. Her death wasn't only a tragedy, it was a scandal, and almost immediately whispers began. Who could possibly want Elizabeth dead? And why would anyone kill a frail, wheelchair-bound woman and the nurse who cared for her? When Duluth police arrived at Glensheen that morning, the mansion felt like something out of a nightmare. The investigation at Glensheen unfolded like a trail of whispers, little details that, when strung together, painted a picture far darker than anyone wanted to believe. Police quickly realized this wasn't random. Whoever had moved through the mansion that night had done it with eerie calm. A bathroom sink was still damp, as if the killer had washed their hands before leaving. Jewelry boxes were emptied, drawers pulled open, a wicker suitcase gone. Down in the basement, a window had been smashed. glass scattered inward. At first glance, it looked like a break-in, but investigators would later decide it was theater, a distraction. The real way in was probably much simpler: a key, or just someone who knew Glensheen well enough to slip inside unnoticed. Then came the escape. The killer didn't run, they didn't hide in the woods. Instead, they slid behind the wheel of Velma Pietla's car and drove south, straight to the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. At 6:35 a.m., a parking stub was time-stamped at the short-term lot. The car was abandoned there, Velma's keys tossed carelessly into a trash can. It was bold, almost casual, as if the killer already believed they'd gotten away with it. Inside the airport, another clue. At a small gift shop, a man bought a suede garment bag with three $20 bills. Witnesses later remembered him juggling a wicker case as he paid. 2 days after the murders, the Duluth Radisson forwarded an envelope to the Caldwell's Hotel in Colorado. Inside was a Byzantine coin, one of the exact pieces missing from Elizabeth's jewelry case. The envelope was postmarked June 27th, the very day of the killings. It was addressed in Roger's handwriting. And when investigators searched the Caldwell's hotel room, the picture grew sharper. There was a wicker case, a suede garment bag, and a box of jewelries that included Elizabeth's own watch and ring. But the final nail wasn't found in luggage. It was in a bank. A notarized letter signed by Marjorie just 3 days before the murders, granting Roger millions from her inheritance upon Elizabeth's death. Prosecutors would later call it the murder contract. Roger Caldwell's trial was the kind that turned Duluth into a stage. The press packed the gallery, reporters scribbling every detail. For the community, it wasn't just about a man on trial. It was about Glensheen, about the Kong Dong legacy, about whether the justice system could untangle a crime this brazen. Roger sat at the defense table looking more like a businessman than a killer. Clean-cut suits, neatly combed hair. He didn't fit the image of a man who had bludgeoned a nurse and smothered an elderly woman. That became part of the tension in the courtroom, this clash between appearance and accusation. As the state laid out its case, Roger's demeanor shifted. Sometimes he looked forward, staring at the floor as witnesses testified. Other times he leaned forward, jaw tight, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. When prosecutors held up the so-called murder contract, he broke into nervous laughter, a reaction that landed poorly with the jury. Witnesses were called: airport employees who remembered the man with the wicker case, handwriting experts who compared the envelope, investigators who walked the jury through Glensheen's blood-stained halls. Each detail built pressure. By the time the jewelry was displayed in evidence bags, you could feel the weight in the room. Roger's defense tried to punch holes, argued the evidence was circumstantial, that the fingerprint on the coin envelope was shaky science, that he was being railroaded because he was married to Marjorie. But Roger himself didn't help. At times, he seemed arrogant, smirking as prosecutors spoke. Other times, he sat slouched and expressionless, as if he'd already resigned himself to the outcome. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. When they filed back in, the room held its breath. Guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Roger blinked hard, but didn't break. No tears, no outburst, just a tight-lipped stare straight ahead as if he didn't hear the words. But outside the courthouse, people cheered. To them, the conviction was justice for Elizabeth, justice for Velma. Still, even in victory, prosecutors knew there was a hole in the story. Roger had been convicted, but the woman many believed that had orchestrated it all, Marjorie, was still waiting for her day in court. If Roger's trial was about evidence, Marjorie's was about perception. She walked into court in 1979, not as a murderer, but as the grieving daughter accused of something harder to prove: conspiracy. The prosecution's argument was clear. Roger might have swung the candlestick and pressed the pillow, but Marjorie had set the stage. She was the one drowning in debt, the one signing the murder contract days before her mother's death, the one who had the most to gain from Elizabeth's fortune. But Marjorie was skilled at something evidence couldn't touch. She knew how to perform. On the stand, she was calm, poised, even sympathetic. She spoke of her mother with affection, playing the role of the dutiful daughter. She admitted to financial troubles, but painted herself as misunderstood, the victim of circumstance. She deflected suspicion onto Roger without ever saying it outright, letting the jury imagine that maybe he had acted alone. The prosecution laid out their case: the notarized document, the timing of Roger's trip, the motive of desperation. But unlike Roger, there was nothing physical that put Marjorie inside Glensheen that night. No fingerprints, no receipts, no direct trail from her hand to the murders. And in the end, that was enough. The jury found her not guilty. The verdict stunned Duluth. Many couldn't believe Marjorie had walked free. Rumors swirled, the press feasted on her image, this elegant, smiling woman who had just slipped through the justice system. Was she innocent or simply untouchable? What no one knew then was that Marjorie's story was far from over. Acquittal didn't cleanse her reputation, it followed her like a ghost. The trial had made her infamous. In Duluth and far beyond, she became the woman many believed had orchestrated her mother's death and walked away smiling. The jury said not guilty, but the public wasn't convinced, and that shadow followed her everywhere she went. What came next only made the whispers louder. In the years after Glensheen, Marjorie's life unraveled in ways that seemed almost cursed. Homes she owned mysteriously caught on fire, not once, but multiple times. Investigators raised eyebrows, insurers grew suspicious, but somehow she always seemed to slip just out of reach. She remarried more than once, and husbands who came into her orbit didn't always survive it. Roger Caldwell himself, years after his release, would spiral into despair and die by suicide. A final, tragic footnote to the saga. And Marjorie, she carried on. Arrests, fraud charges, prison time. Her name became tied to scandal after scandal, from Minnesota to Arizona to California. Wherever she went, trouble followed. But no matter how far she traveled, one place clung to her story like a ghost: Glensheen. Today, Glensheen is a museum. Each year, thousands of visitors wander its halls, marveling at the carved woodwork, the gleaming antiques, and the sweeping views of Lake Superior. But nearly all of them slow at one particular place: the staircase landing where Velma Pietla lost her life. The guides don't shy away from the story. They acknowledge the murders, careful but unflinching. Still, for many visitors, acknowledgement isn't enough. Some say the house feels heavier there, that the air seems to press in, that the silence in Elizabeth's bedroom just hangs a beat too long. For Minnesotans, Glensheen is more than just a historic mansion. It is a monument to wealth, shadowed by betrayal. A place where privilege could not shield a family from violence, and where, even now, justice feels like an unfinished story. On a frigid February night in 2013, a young woman vanished after a simple dinner date with her husband. Her name was Kiera Sager Trevino. She was only 30 years old, bright, warm, ambitious, and just beginning to carve out a life she loved. She worked as a store manager at Delia's in the Mall of America, and she had a close circle of friends and coworkers who adored her. But behind the surface of her marriage, there were fractures. Kira's relationship with her husband, Jeffrey Trevino, was unraveling. strained by lies, infidelity, and secrets. By the time police were called, it was too late. There would be no missing persons mystery dragging on for years. Within days, investigators were convinced they knew what had happened. And when the truth came out in court, it revealed a story of betrayal and violence that stunned Minnesota. Kira and Jeffrey Trevino lived in a modest rambler on St. Paul's east side, the kind of house that blended in, one you might pass 100 times without a second thought. To neighbors, they looked like any other couple in their early 30s, building a quiet life together. But behind closed doors, the picture wasn't as tidy. Kira had been restless. Friends would later recall how she confided to them that she was unhappy, that she had thought about leaving Jeffrey for good. Still, on the night of Friday, February 22nd, 2013, things looked ordinary enough. The two went out to dinner together. They wandered the sprawling corridors of the Mall of America. For Kira, the mall was familiar ground. She spent her work days managing Delia's, a teen fashion store where the racks overflowed with neon colors and pop music pulsed endlessly. Their outing wasn't unusual. It wasn't tense. Nothing about it, at least to anyone watching, suggested that this would be the last night Kira Trevino would ever be seen alive. The next morning, Saturday, the first cracks in that ordinary facade began to show. Kira never arrived for her shift at Delia's. To some people, skipping a shift might not raise immediate alarms. But to those who knew her, it was unthinkable. Kira was reliable, the kind of manager who always showed up, always answered her phone, always texted back. But that morning, her phone sat silent. Calls rolled to voicemail. Texts were left undelivered. By midday, her coworkers began exchanging worried glances. By evening, worry hardened into dread. Hours slipped by, and still no word from Kira. On Sunday, when she missed yet another shift, her absence could no longer be brushed off as a fluke. That's when police were finally called. And once they stepped inside the Trevino home, what they found would turn a simple missing person report into one of St. Paul's most haunting murder cases. It didn't take long for investigators to realize something was terribly wrong. When officers stepped into Kira and Jeffrey's Eastside home, the air was thick with unease. On the surface, it looked ordinary enough. A modest house with groceries on the counter, laundry folded on the sofa, little signs of everyday life left in motion. But then the details started to emerge. Small droplets of blood marked the hardwood floor. Faint smears traced along the wall near the hallway. And in certain rooms, the sharp, unmistakable sting of bleach lingered in the air. Someone had been scrubbing, but not well enough. It wasn't cleaning, it was covering up. Jeffrey Trevino told police that after their night out, Kira had left him. He said she stormed off in anger, maybe staying with a friend. He insisted there was nothing more to it, but detectives quickly realized his story had gaps. Too many gaps. The first step was to retrace her movements. Footage from Mall of America confirmed Jeffrey's account, at least in part. The couple had been there Friday night, leaving together just before closing. Meanwhile, her absence was setting off alarm bells with the people who knew her best. Co-workers told police that Kira was dependable, the kind of person who didn't just vanish from work. Friends confirmed she hadn't reached out, not even with a quick message. Her parents hadn't heard from her either. For someone as rooted in routine as Kara, her silence was unthinkable. Police started canvassing the neighborhood. They knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen Kara that weekend. Some neighbors remembered hearing voices. maybe an argument, but nothing conclusive. Others mentioned seeing Jeffrey's car come and go at odd hours. Still, there was no sign of Kira herself. It was as if she had been swallowed up between Friday night and Saturday morning. Days passed, and unease only grew. Each hour without a trace of her chipped away at the hope that she had simply walked away. This wasn't a cooling off period. This wasn't a missing person case that ended with a tearful reunion. Something violent had happened. And then came the first major break. Kira's car, a white Pontiac G6, was discovered abandoned in a parking lot not far from the mall. At first glance, the vehicle looked untouched. But when investigators opened up the doors, the truth was undeniable. Blood stains marked the interior. Cleanup attempts were obvious. The surfaces wiped, smears half erased. Whoever parked that car hadn't just left it behind. They had tried to erase Kira inside it. By then, police weren't asking if a crime had been committed. The only question left was who had committed it. And all the evidence, no matter how carefully scrubbed, was beginning to circle back to Jeffrey Trevino. As detectives dug deeper, Jeffrey's calm exterior began to crack. At first, he spoke evenly, offering rehearsed explanations for Kira's absence. But under questioning, the mask slipped. He admitted what others already knew. Their marriage was strained. Kira had grown distant. She had even been seeing another man. Still, Jeffrey insisted he hadn't harmed her. He claimed he was the wronged husband, left behind when she walked away. But the evidence told a different story. Forensic testing confirmed what investigators feared. The blood scattered through the home belonged to Kira. Tiny droplets in the bathroom, smears in the hallway, and then the most damning discovery: a section of carpet pulled back, revealing flooring beneath that was still soaked with her blood. The surface had been cleaned, but not well enough to erase what happened there. While detectives built their case inside the house, the outside world was mobilizing. The Twin Cities rallied for Kira. Volunteers blanketed neighborhoods, searching along roadsides, wooded trails, and frozen bends of the Mississippi. Flyers with her picture, a smiling brunette with kind eyes, were taped to every lamppost and bulletin board. Local media covered every update, her story dominating headlines and nightly news. For a time, it seemed the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for answers. But Jeffrey Trevino didn't join them. While strangers braved the cold to search for his wife, he stayed away. He didn't walk with the volunteers. He didn't stand before cameras to plead for her safe return. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. To those who watched him closely, it seemed as though he already knew she wasn't coming home. By early March, the case against Jeffrey Trevino had shifted from troubling to undeniable. Prosecutors know that without a body, a murder trial is one of the hardest to win. Juries want certainty. They want to see what happened. Without that, defense attorneys can argue endlessly that the victim is alive somewhere, that they chose to disappear. Even so, the evidence was mounting too quickly to ignore. Detectives also noted Jeffrey's behavior: the lack of emotion, the refusal to join searches, the way he spoke about Kira in past tense, as though he already knew she would never be found alive. On March 5th, 2013, less than 2 weeks after Kira's disappearance, prosecutors charged Jeffrey Trevino with 2 counts of second-degree murder. It was a bold move, given the body was still missing, but investigators were confident. For Kira's family and the hundreds of volunteers who had spent days combing through the Twin Cities, the charges were a double-edged moment. Relief that someone was being held accountable, but devastation that had all confirmed their worst fear. They weren't looking for a woman anymore. They were searching for her remains. By early May, nearly 11 weeks had passed since Kira vanished. The official searches had quieted, but the Mississippi still carried whispers of her name. Locals knew that when the ice broke and the river swelled, it sometimes gave up secrets. On the morning of May 8th, 2013, a man walking near the river in St. Paul noticed something. Something caught along the brush at the water's edge. At first, he thought it was debris, a log maybe, tangled in spring runoff. But as he drew closer, a shape began to take form. Clothing, hair, a pale arm, twisted unnaturally in the current. The man froze. The silence of the river pressed in, only by the rush of water. And then, with a trembling hand, he dialed 911. When officers arrived, they immediately secured the area. Even hardened investigators felt the weight of what they were seeing. The body of a woman, badly decomposed from weeks in the water, lay tangled in the branches. Recovery teams moved carefully, documenting every angle, every detail, before bringing her to shore. Back at the medical examiner's office, the confirmation came quickly. Dental records and personal identifiers left no doubt. The woman in the river was 30-year-old Kira Steger Trevino. News spread across the Twin Cities in hours. Volunteers who had searched in the bitter cold wept. Flyers that once asked, "Have you seen Kira?" now stood as memorials. For her family, the confirmation brought both devastation and a grim kind of relief. Their worst fears were real, but at least now there was no more waiting, no more wondering. They could finally bring her home. And for prosecutors, the discovery meant their case against Jeffrey Torino was no longer rested on circumstantial bloodstains and missing person suspicion. They now had the most definitive evidence of all, Kira herself. When Kira's body was recovered, prosecutors finally had the confirmation they needed. The trial of Jeffrey Trevino opened that fall, drawing heavy attention from the media and community alike. Every seat in the Ramsey County courtroom seemed filled. Reporters with notepads, neighbors curious and unsettled, and Kira's family who endured each day of testimony with quiet grief. The prosecution's case was clear. Kira hadn't run away. She had been killed inside her own home. They relied on forensic experts to explain how much blood was found and why it was consistent with fatal injuries. They leaned on the recovery of her body to close the gap the defense once tried to exploit. Proof that Kira was, without question, dead. The defense tried to cast doubt, suggesting the evidence was circumstantial, that no one had witnessed Jeffrey commit violence, that perhaps her death was the result of something other than murder. But their arguments fell flat against the mountain of facts. When the verdict was read, guilty of unintentional second-degree murder, the courtroom was silent except for the muffled sobs of Kira's loved ones. Jeffrey Trevino was sentenced to 27 years in prison. For the public, the outcome brought closure to a story that had hung heavy over the Twin Cities for months. For Kira's family, it was justice, though not the kind anyone had wanted. They set out to find her. They had succeeded. But what they brought home was not their daughter, their friend, their co-worker, only the truth of what happened to her. It was a September morning in 1931 when Duluth awoke to a discovery so unsettling it seemed ripped from a nightmare. Along the wind-whipped shoreline of Lake Superior, workers found a burlap sack tangled among rocks. No ordinary driftwood. Inside lay a woman's torso, decapitated, dismembered, and anonymous. Washed ashore without a name, without a face, without a clue. This was more than a murder. It was a disappearance that had already been methodically scrubbed of identity. On the morning of September 20th, 1931, two city workers made their way along the shoreline of Lake Superior in Duluth. Their job was simple: clear debris after a night of heavy waves. The lake was known to spit up all kinds of things: logs, broken crates, even the occasional dead animal. That morning, the wind whipped across the water, carrying the scent of cold iron and fish. As the men made their way over the rocks, one of them spotted something wedged between the stones: a burlap sack. It was swollen, heavy, and waterlogged. Its rough fabric snagged against the jagged shoreline. At first glance, the men figured it was just trash. Maybe an old sack of grain that had fallen off a ship. Maybe garbage tossed into the water upriver. Nothing unusual. But when they tried to lift it, the weight was wrong. It didn't shift like sand. It didn't crumble like grain. It sagged. It bent. The men exchanged a look, uneasy but curious. They tugged at the twine knot sealing the top of the sack, expecting to find rotting food or scrap metal. Instead, the burlap opened just enough to reveal pale flesh beneath. One of the workers staggered back, gagging. What he saw didn't make sense, not at first, but then it hit him. It was human. Inside the sack was the torso of a woman, decapitated, dismembered, pieces missing. The men stumbled back in shock. They weren't looking at driftwood or garbage. They were staring at what remained of a human being. And in that moment, Duluth's most chilling mystery was born. Word traveled fast in 1931, especially when the news was this grotesque. Within hours, officers and detectives were swarming the rocky shoreline where the burlap sack had been found. The setting only added to the horror. Lake Superior was never just a lake. It was a force. Vast, cold, and unpredictable. It had claimed thousands of lives over the years, swallowing ships whole and earning the name the Graveyard of the Great Lakes. For Duluth, the lake was lifeblood. It carried steel, timber, and grain across the Midwest, fueling the city's boom. But locals knew its darker side: how quickly calm water could turn violent, how often it kept its dead. At first, the scene was chaos. Even hardened men, used to bar fights gone bad, bootlegging, shootouts, and drownings in the harbor, struggled to stomach what they were seeing. The body had been mutilated beyond recognition. No head, no arms, no legs, just a torso stripped of everything that could name her. But the lake wasn't finished. 2 days later, another gruesome package appeared. Not far from where the torso had been found, waves carried in a pair of legs. They had been severed so cleanly, it was clear this wasn't rage or clumsy violence. Someone had taken their time. The sight of them, pale and waterlogged, left even the coroner whispering that the killer had known exactly what they were doing. A few days after that, an arm washed up, tangled in weeds. The fingers curled stiffly, skin pruned from days in the water. Police couldn't shake the thought: somewhere out there, more pieces were drifting just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. After the initial discoveries, the investigation turned to the lake itself. Detectives believed the rest of her body had to be out there, drifting beneath the surface, waiting to rise. For days, officers and volunteers dragged the water with nets and hooked poles, pulling up weeds, logs, and the occasional sack of debris. Each time something bobbed to the surface, the crowd that gathered on the shoreline would go silent, holding their breath, waiting to see if another piece of her had returned. But the head, the one thing that could give her a name, never appeared. The lake held it back, or perhaps it was never there at all. Officers posted along the rocky shoreline watched for days, bracing themselves every time the waves pushed something else close. Children were warned to stay away from the water. Fishermen whispered about pale shapes drifting below, shapes they swore weren't fish. The search dragged on, but Superior gave nothing more. And with every empty hall, it became clearer. The killer had known exactly what they were doing. Without a face, without fingerprints, without a name, they were blind. This was 1931. Forensics as we know it today didn't exist. No DNA testing, no computer databases, even fingerprints were useless without hands. All detectives could do was comb through missing persons reports, hoping someone fit the description of a woman who'd simply vanished. But what description could they use? They had no face, no height, no weight, not even a confident age. Doctors could only estimate she was a young to middle-aged woman. Beyond that, she was a ghost. The medical examiner worked quietly as the remains were brought in. Piece by piece, Lake Superior had given her back, and now it was his job to try and make sense of her. He laid the torso on the table first, then the legs, then the arms. Each piece pale, water-swollen, yet unsettlingly precise in the way it had been cut. Officers leaned in close, some grimacing, others just staring, waiting for him to say something. Anything that could give this woman a name. But what he said only deepened the mystery. The cuts, he explained, weren't jagged or clumsy. These weren't the frenzied slashes of a killer in a fit of rage. They were deliberate, measured. Whoever had done this had taken their time. The edges of the wounds were sharp and clean, almost surgical. The room grew tense. If the killer knew how to cut a body apart this carefully, it suggested something far darker. A doctor, a butcher, or someone who had done this before. Reporters scribbled every word, desperate for detail, while detectives hovered, pressing the examiner for more. Was there anything else? A scar, a mark, a clue? But there was nothing. The heads and hands, the most vital pieces for identification, were missing. The examiner could only say no signs of disease, no scars of childbirth. Beyond that, nothing. It was as if the kidnapper had stripped her not only of her life, but her entire existence. That realization sent a chill through investigators. This wasn't a drunken fight gone too far. It wasn't random. This was careful, planned, and whoever did it wanted her identity erased. Almost immediately, the theories started. Some whispered the victim was a sex worker, someone vulnerable, whose disappearance might not draw much attention. Others thought she might have been an out-of-towner, dumped in the lake and carried by the current until Duluth became her grave. And then there was a darker theory, organized crime. Prohibition had turned Duluth into a hotbed of smuggling. Booze, money, and power moved quietly through the port. A torso and a sack could have been a warning. Don't cross the wrong people. But despite the rumors, no missing woman matched. No one stepped forward. It was as though she'd been erased from both body and memory. The newspapers wasted no time turning it into a front-page horror. Headlines screamed about the torso murder mystery. And printed every grisly detail investigators uncovered. Illustrations showed burlap sacks bobbing on black waves. Reporters speculated wildly. Was it the work of a madman? a jealous lover, a mob enforcer making a statement. For weeks, the story dominated conversation. Ordinary people avoided the shoreline, afraid of what might surface next. Parents warned their children to stay away from the water. Even longshoremen, the men who made their living on the lake, talked about an unease they couldn't shake, as though Lake Superior itself had turned against them. Despite the public hysteria, the truth remained painfully simple. No one knew who she was. No one knew who had done this. And as the days turned into weeks, the once loud panic began to settle into something worse: silence. A silence that felt less like closure and more like the killer had gotten away with it. As weeks turned into months, the case that had once gripped Duluth began to slip into the shadows. Police had exhausted every detail, every angle. They'd combed through missing persons across Minnesota and even reached out to nearby states, hoping someone, anyone, might report a woman gone missing who'd match their remains. But the problem was simple and chilling. Time passed, the police file grew dustier, leads grew colder, witnesses forgot details or moved away or died. Eventually, even the newspapers stopped printing updates. The torso, the arms, the legs, they were gathered, examined, then finally laid to rest. She was buried quietly in a pauper's grove. The torso, the legs, the arm, they were gathered, examined, and then finally laid to rest. She was buried quietly in a pauper's grave with no marker to tell the world who she was. The case was closed, not solved, but closed in the way unsolved murders often are, swallowed by silence and bureaucracy. And that silence might be the most unsettling part of all, because it means whoever did this, whoever dismembered a woman, packed her into sacks, and tossed her into Lake Superior, walked away. They disappeared back into the world, never caught, never questioned, and nearly a century later, they remain nameless, just like their victim. For most people in Duluth, the torso mystery was a one-off horror story, a gruesome, unsolved killing that faded into whispers once the investigation went cold. But looking back, the timing is hard to ignore, because just a few years later, across the Great Lakes in Cleveland, Ohio, a new nightmare began. In 1934, 3 years after Duluth's torso was found, Cleveland police discovered the remains of a decapitated man. The following year, another, and another, and another. Over the next few years, more than a dozen bodies turned up in and around the city, all butchered in a disturbingly similar way, dismembered, stripped of identity. The press gave it a name: the Cleveland Torso Murders. The killer they called the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Line them up side by side, the similarities between Duluth and Cleveland are chilling. Both victims and body parts were discovered near water. Both had been dismembered with a level of skill, cut clean and deliberate. Both stripped the victims of their identities, often through decapitation. And in both cases, the killer was never caught. Now, here's where it gets unsettling. The Cleveland murders stretched from 1934 to 1938, but Duluth's torso washed up in 1931, which raises the question, was Duluth the beginning? Some criminologists have speculated that the Duluth torso might have been an early crime committed by the same person who later became infamous in Cleveland. A trial run, so to speak. A practice in anonymity, perfected years later. Others argue it was a coincidence. After all, torso murders weren't entirely uncommon in that area. Between prohibition, organized crime, and the lack of forensic science, dismemberment was a cruel but effective way to hide someone's identity. But the idea that Duluth's victim might have been the first known victim of one of America's most notorious uncaught serial killers, That's a theory too dark to ignore.
It was supposed to be an ordinary late summer day in St. Cloud, Minnesota. For 15-year-old Mary Raker and her 12-year-old sister Suzanne, it was a chance to ride into town, buy a few things before school started, and enjoy the last of their freedom before fall routines set back in. But that afternoon, as the sisters walked along Northway Drive carrying new clothes and school supplies, someone noticed them. Someone who followed. By nightfall, the sisters had vanished. 2 weeks later, their bodies were discovered at the bottom of an abandoned quarry, and for nearly half a century, no one knew who put them there. This is the story of the Raker sisters, a mystery that haunted St. Cloud for 45 years before the truth finally emerged. St. Cloud in the 1970s was the picture of Midwestern normalcy. A college town of about 40,000 people just an hour northwest of Minneapolis. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved from porches, families left their front doors unlocked, and kids rode bikes across town without a second thought. Life moved at a steady, predictable rhythm. The Rakers family embodied that rhythm. Fred and Rita, devout Catholics, were raising 9 children under one roof, a bustling household where older children were expected to help with the younger ones, and everyone pitched in to make things run smoothly. Among them were Mary and Suzanne, 2 of the middle daughters. Mary, 15, was thoughtful and responsible, the type of girl who did well in school and often helped her mom keep the house in order. She had a creative side too, and loved sewing. Her current project was a skirt she'd been carefully planning. Suzanne, just 12, was softer spoken, still caught in that in-between stage of girlhood where she leaned on her older sister for guidance. The two were close, often seen together around town. On the morning of Saturday, September 28, 1974, Mary and Suzanne asked their parents if they could walk into town. Their plan was simple: pick up some school supplies and maybe buy fabric for Mary's sewing project. Fred and Rita agreed, reminding them to be home in time for dinner. The girls dressed up for the crisp fall air. Mary slipped into her blue windbreaker, while Suzanne chose a light jacket. Together, they set out on foot toward the Zare discount store, about 1.5 miles away from their home. It was a common enough errand, one they'd made before. That September afternoon had the kind of light that made everything look softer. Trees edged in gold, the sky washed clear. The Raker girls fit right into the scene. 2 sisters strolling side by side with paper bags crinkling at their sides. At Zare, they picked through notebooks and pencils, the kind of small errands every student needed before fall settled in. A cashier would later remember how polite they were, Mary doing most of the talking, while Suzanne nodded along. At another stop, someone noticed them pause by a rack of fabric. Mary held it up against the light, tilting her head the way only someone serious about sewing would. That memory stuck, not because it was unusual, but because it was so ordinary. Witnesses along Northway Drive recalled the same thing. The girls looked happy, lost in conversation, smiling in that private way sisters do when they're talking about something no one else can hear. They blended so completely into the background of that Saturday, the college kids hurrying past, the families loading groceries, the traffic humming steady down the road. And yet, that ordinariness is what makes those last sightings ache. People remembered their jackets, the blue windbreaker, the lighter coat, and the way the shopping bags swung gently as they walked. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing felt off, and that's what made it so haunting. because those unremarkable details were the last traces anyone would ever see of Mary and Suzanne alive. As the afternoon wore on, the Rakers' house carried on its usual rhythm. Younger kids played in the yard, Rita moved through the kitchen, and Fred busied himself with small chores. Mary and Suzanne were expected back before supper. It wasn't even something anyone thought twice about. They were responsible girls, and their mile-and-a-half walk home was familiar, well-traveled. But as the sun dipped lower, Rita began glancing at the clock. 5 o'clock came and went. The girls still weren't home. She told herself they might have stopped to talk with friends, or maybe Mary had lost track of time at the fabric counter. By 6 o'clock, though, Rita was looking out the front window more often than she was cooking. When Fred called everyone to the dinner table, 2 chairs sat empty. The chatter of 7 other children filled the room, but the silence where Mary and Suzanne should have been was deafening. Rita's fork sat untouched on her plate. After dinner, she picked up the phone and began calling neighbors, then friends from church. Each answer was the same. No one had seen them. By nightfall, unease turned to panic. Fred drove the familiar streets, hoping to spot the girls walking home in the dark. Rita stayed by the phone, waiting for it to ring with some simple explanation. At 9 p.m., Fred did what no parent ever wants to do. He called the St. Cloud police. When Fred's call came in, police logged the report but treated it with little urgency. 2 young girls missing on a Saturday night didn't immediately raise alarms. Officers suggested the most common explanations. They had gone to a friend's house, maybe lost track of time, maybe even decided to stay overnight somewhere without asking permission. In the 1970s, that line of thinking wasn't unusual. Teens and preteens often vanished for a night and turned up by morning. To police, it looked like a runaway situation, not a crime, but Rita Raker refused to accept that. Her daughters weren't like that, she insisted. Mary had been excited about school, had even bought fabric for a sewing project she couldn't wait to start. Suzanne was quiet, shy, not the kind of child who disappeared without a word, and both girls had promised to be home for dinner. They weren't wild, they weren't reckless, they were steady, reliable. Something was different here. Fred echoed her certainty. He'd driven every familiar route, scanned sidewalks, knocked on doors. No one had seen them. No one had heard from them. The officers listened, but their posture didn't shift much that night. They told Fred and Rita to try to get some rest, that the girls might very well walk through the front door by morning. But sleep never really came to the Raker house that night. After the call to the police, Rita stayed near the phone, staring at it as if sheer willpower could make it ring. Every creak of the house made her heart jump. She replayed the afternoon in her mind on an endless loop. What time the girls left, what they wore, whether she'd missed some small clue when they walked out of the door. Fred tried to be the steady one. He paced. Then he drove the streets again in the dark, headlights sweeping across empty sidewalks and storefronts long since closed for the night. He circled past Northway Drive more than once, looking for any sign of movement. Each pass ended the same. Silence, emptiness, nothing. Inside the house, the other children picked up on the tension. Bedtimes came and went, but no one slept easily. Some of the younger ones whispered questions. Where are Mary and Suzanne? Questions their parents couldn't answer. Rita tucked them in. but her voice trembled as she promised everything would be okay. By midnight, the truth hung heavy in the air. The girls hadn't simply lost track of time. They weren't at a friend's house, and no matter what the police suggested, Fred and Rita knew their daughters weren't coming home on their own. So they waited. The clock ticked into the small hours of Sunday morning, every minute stretching into an eternity. The house, usually full of laughter and noise, felt unbearable in its silence, and with every passing hour, the fear solidified into certainty. Something terrible had happened to Mary and Suzanne. By sunrise on Sunday, September 29th, the Rakers' worst fears had not lifted. Mary and Suzanne's beds were still empty, their school supplies still stacked neatly where they'd left them the day before. Rita hadn't slept at all. Fred, hollow-eyed, was already back out driving when the first light spilled across St. Cloud. This time, when the Rakers called police again, the tone was different. The girls hadn't turned up. No friends had seen them, and their absence now stretched into the second day. Officers began to take the case seriously. A missing persons investigation was opened. Word spread quickly through town. Neighbors knocked on the Rakers' door offering help. Friends from church came by with coffee, sandwiches, and questions. What were they wearing? Where did they say they were going? By mid-morning, volunteers fanned out along the routes the girls might have taken. Some drove slowly with windows open, calling their names. Others walked in small groups, scanning the ground for anything dropped or out of place. At the same time, police began retracing the sisters' last known movements. Officers visited the Zayre's store, then Woolworth's, speaking to clerks who confirmed seeing the girls. The timeline became clearer. Yes, they had been there. They had made their purchases. They had left carrying bags. But after that, the trail went cold. By afternoon, St. Cloud was buzzing with unease. In a town where children walked freely and families left doors unlocked, two sisters had vanished in broad daylight. And despite the growing search, no one could answer the question echoing through every home, every church pew, and every gathering place. Where were Mary and Suzanne Raker? As Sunday bled into Monday, the search for Mary and Suzanne intensified. Search dogs were brought to sniff along ditches and wooded patches, their handlers urging them forward as the animals tugged against their leashes. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through fields on the edge of town, pushing back tall grass with their boots, scanning for any sign of the missing girls. Helicopters circled overhead, their engines rumbling across St. Cloud, dipping low to scour the rivers, gravel pits, and farmland that framed the city. It was no longer just a family crisis. It was the town's. St. Cloud, with its reputation for safety and small-town trust, was suddenly unsettled. The Rakers Church community organized prayer vigils, packing pews with neighbors clutching rosaries and whispering for a miracle. Flyers with sisters' school photos, two fresh-faced girls with brown hair and cautious smiles were tacked to telephone poles and taped to storefront windows. Still, there was nothing. Each fruitless day deepened the dread. A community that had once prided itself on safety now locked its doors at night. Parents tightened their grips on their children's hands. For Fred and Rita, the house grew unbearably still. Mary's half-finished sewing project sat untouched. Suzanne's favorite books waited by her bedside. The search was escalating, the community rallying. The morning of September 30th was gray and still, the kind of quiet that makes the sound carry farther than it should. It was one of those overgrown stretches near an abandoned quarry that the silence broke. A volunteer called out, and officers rushed to his side. There, in the flattened grass, lay Mary and Suzanne. The scene was jarring in its clarity. Their jackets, Mary's blue windbreaker, Suzanne's lighter coat. Police at the scene struggled to hold composure, the brutality standing in cruel contrast to the innocence of the sisters' belongings. At the Raker home, the knock at the door delivered the news Fred and Rita had already feared but couldn't bear to hear spoken out loud. Their daughters were gone. The shopping trip, the skirt Mary had dreamed of sewing, Suzanne's quiet companionship, all of it had been cut short in a single act of cruelty. The Rakers, surrounded by family and friends, were left with the unbearable truth. Their daughter's ordinary Saturday errand had ended in horror. St. Cloud wasn't just grieving, it was reeling. A town that had once embodied small town safety now lived with a new, unwelcome truth. Evil had walked among them, and no one knew who it was. Detectives scoured the quarry for evidence. The ground around the girls told a story, though a frustratingly incomplete one. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints that led away, and no drag marks suggesting the bodies had been moved from another location. It looked as though Mary and Suzanne had been killed where they were found. The brutality of the wounds weighed heavily on investigators. Multiple stab wounds to each girl and the slashing of their throats suggested rage. Personal, targeted violence. This wasn't opportunistic robbery. Their money and belongings were still there. It wasn't a sexual assault either. Nothing pointed that way. Whoever killed them had wanted to end them. That led detectives to their first theory. The killer wasn't a stranger passing through. He might have been someone from St. Cloud. Someone with a grudge. Someone who recognized them. That thought unsettled everyone. If it was true, then the murderer wasn't out there somewhere. He was here, living among them. The other theory was equally chilling. A drifter. St. Cloud sat on routes often used by hitchhikers, truckers, and transient workers. Someone could have passed through town, spotted the girls, and acted without warning. If that was the case, he could be long gone, and catching him might be impossible. Detectives pulled in everyone they could think of. Local men with criminal histories, drifters seen in town that weekend, even acquaintances of the Rakers. Each was questioned and each denied involvement. No evidence tied anyone to the murders. The lack of progress gnawed at the police and the public alike. The investigation had only begun, but it was tangled in dead ends. In the days after Mary and Suzanne were found, detectives turned their focus to suspects. The violence was so frenzied, so personal, that the investigators believe it had to be someone close, someone who knew the girls, or at least recognized them. The first and most painful step was to look inward. Fred and Rita Raker were questioned at length, their timelines picked apart. Police searched for cracks, for inconsistencies, for any hint that the parents knew more than they claimed, but nothing surfaced. Neighbors had seen Fred searching the streets the night the girls went missing, and Rita had been home with the younger children. Their grief was raw and undeniable. Within days, investigators ruled the family out. Despite dozens of interviews and tips, a few names rose to the top of the suspect list. The first was a local man with a history of violence who had been seen in the area that weekend. He was known to carry knives, and his temper was no secret. Detectives questioned him heavily, convinced at first they'd found their man. But his alibi, confirmed by family, held up. Without physical evidence, they had nothing. Another early suspect was a drifter who had passed through St. Cloud right about the time the sisters vanished. He was picked up in a nearby county after bragging he knew details about the murders. For a moment, it looked like the break the police were desperate for, but under pressure, his story unraveled. Everything he knew had already been printed in the newspapers. Once the bluff was exposed, investigators had to let him go. Then there was a mysterious car. Multiple witnesses swore they saw a dark sedan. Some said green, others brown, moving slowly along Northway Drive the afternoon Mary and Suzanne were walking home. It was reported again near the quarry where the bodies were found. Police pulled records, stopped cars that matched the description, even tracked down a few drivers. Each one denied involvement, and none could be tied to the murders. The car slipped into legend, a ghost vehicle that haunted the investigation for years. In the end, none of it stuck, and that was the most terrifying part. Their top suspects either cleared themselves or were cleared by circumstance, leaving St. Cloud staring into the void. By winter, the case files grew thick with reports but thin on answers. Detectives revisited the quarry, sifted through the evidence again, and pored over witness statements, but the picture never sharpened. The physical evidence was meager. No murder weapon, no fingerprints, no forensic trail that pointed to a killer. In 1974, DNA testing was decades away. What they had was circumstantial at best, and that wasn't enough to charge anyone. Eventually, the case went cold. It sat in the St. Cloud police files, passed from one detective to another over the years, each hoping for a break that never came. The murders of Mary and Suzanne Raker became a ghost story in central Minnesota, whispered about in classrooms, remembered in news clippings on anniversaries, and never truly forgotten by the people who lived through it. By the 1990s, the murders of Mary and Suzanne Raker had faded from the headlines, but not from memory. Other cases had taken center stage, most notably the abduction of 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling in 1989, just 30 miles from St. Cloud. That case drew national attention, changing the way the country viewed child safety and leading to new laws on sex offender registries. But detectives never let it go. In a police storage room sat boxes marked with the sisters' names, Mary and Suzanne, their blood-stained clothing, bags of school supplies, knives are covered near the scene, stacks of brittle witness statements. Each file told the same story, over and over, but without an ending. Every few years, a new investigator would open up the case again, leafing through the reports, yellowed with age, walking the quarry site that had long since grown over with weeds. The evidence was always the same, but the hope was that technology, something beyond the reach of 1970s forensics, might finally reveal what human memory and witness accounts could not. The breakthrough came not in the frantic days of the 1970s, but decades later, thanks to something investigators back then could never have imagined. As forensic science advanced, investigators submitted the samples for testing. What returned was the kind of lead they had waited nearly half a century for, a DNA profile strong enough to identify a suspect. The name was Jerome Henry Tiffy Edwards. He wasn't a stranger to violence. Edwards had a history of knife assaults and explosive outbursts. He'd lived in St. Cloud in 1974, drifting from place to place, and had left town not long after Mary and Suzanne were killed. For decades, he slipped beneath the radar, moving on, starting over, leaving his past behind. By the time investigators had his name, Edwards was already dead. He had died in 2015, never facing a jury, never answering for what he had done, but science spoke where he could not. When police compared the DNA from Suzanne's clothing to samples from Edward's family, the results were undeniable. It was him, the drifter who had haunted the edges of the investigation in rumor and theory, was now confirmed as the killer. After 45 years, the mystery that had gripped St. Cloud finally had an answer. Justice had come too late for the courtroom, too late for Fred and Rita to see their daughter's killer held accountable. But the truth at last had been unearthed from the silence. Mary and Suzanne's story was no longer an unsolved case file. It was a wound with a name. The murders of Mary and Suzanne Raker never got the same national attention as Jacob Wetterling, but for central Minnesota, they were just as defining. And when the case was solved 45 years later, it stood as proof of what families often cling to, that even in the coldest cases, answers can eventually surface.